2019. Okay, so we could start with 3 times the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay. So we're continuing now with our reading of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Book of the Threes. And now we come to a whole chapter of suttas which are concerned with what is called the threefold training, or actually it's the threefold higher training. Okay, so we could just look at the first sutta in this collection, then I'm going to jump to some later suttas in this chapter that elaborate on them. Let us make sure that we have right magnification. Okay, so these are described by the sutta as 3, here I'm using a makeshift rendering, 3 ascetic tasks to be practiced by an ascetic. And the word here, used here, is, for ascetic, is samana, which was a word which was in common usage in the Buddha's period. It's not specific to the Buddha's teaching, but it's a word that indicates those who have gone forth into homelessness to lead a life, call it a life of spiritual seeking, either directed towards philosophical understanding or experiential realization. And so there are many, many sects of samanas contemporary with the Buddha. And often we find in the Buddhist texts a contrast made, or rather a grouping made, of 2 types of persons who are devoted to the spiritual life. These are samanas and brahmanas. And when they speak about brahmanas in conjunction with samanas, it seems to indicate not the ordinary Brahmins who perform the priestly duties, the rituals and ceremonies of the Brahminic community, but rather those I would understand who are devoted to maybe living a contemplative life that is in some way rooted in texts stemming from the Vedas. Perhaps the forest ascetics who were the constituency of the Upanishads. Okay, and so when the Buddha left the princely life and went into homelessness, he became a samana. And so the non-Buddhist contemporaries of the Buddha would refer to him as Samana Gotama, the ascetic Gotama. And the Buddhist monks, as a community, are known as the Sakya Putiya Samanas. And this is sometimes misunderstood, I think even within the Buddhist tradition, as the monks who are sons of the Buddha. And so we have now Buddhist nuns saying that they are Sakyadita, daughters of the Buddha. But I think this is a misunderstanding of the Pali. Sakya Putiya Samana. Maybe somebody's going to use this. Okay, I could open a blank file. Okay, so Sakya refers to the clan of the Buddha. The word Puta means son. And so the common way of taking this is as if it were Sakya Puta Samana, the ascetics who are sons of the Sakyan, the Sakyan being the Buddha, Sakya Muni. But actually, Sakya Putiya is an adjective based on Sakya Puta. And who is Sakya Puta? Exactly. The Buddha is Sakya Puta. He is described as a son of the Sakyans, and that he is at the beginning of his teaching career, he was a young man from the Sakyan clan. So Sakya Putiya Samana are not ascetics who are sons of the Buddha, but they are ascetics who are, Putiya turns it into an adjective, ascetics who are followers of the Sakyan son, or ascetics who, followers of the Sakyan son, ascetics who in some way belong to the Sakyan son. So the Sakyan son is the Buddha himself. And so I don't know the feminine for samana, samani. So also the Buddhist nuns would be Sakya Putiya Samani, Samaniyo, female ascetics who are followers of the Sakyan son, not Sakya, not Sakyadita. And within these 5 minutes, I've just brought down the name of the International Buddhist Women's Organization. But, I mean, it's become a neologism, a new term, Sakyadita, so let it be used. Okay, so now we come back to our sutta. Okay, so the sutta says that there are these three samana karaniyani. So karaniyani means things to be done and by a samana. And so what are these three things? It's said to be the addi sila sika samadhanam. Samadhanam means undertaking, taking up. Okay, then sika is training. So sika, we can see, will be common to all three of them. Then we have the expressions, the distinguishing expressions, addi sila, addi citta, addi panya. Okay, now we know these three words, we've come across them over and over. Sila, actually citta is being used here in a somewhat unusual sense. And panya. So sila, citta, and panya, three words that we're familiar with from many other contexts, except, as I said, citta is being used here in a somewhat unusual sense. Now, each of these, you could see, has the prefix addi. And addi has the nuance, it's a prefix, it's not an independent word, but it's a prefix that has the nuance of above, over, superior, elevated. And so we have, for example, a word, pati. Pati, one of the meanings is a lord or a master. And then it takes on the extended meaning, sorry ladies, in the family life of being the husband. Okay, then it gets the prefix adi. Adi means something like an overlord, like maybe in political terms it would be like the governor of a district, whereas pati might be like the master of an estate. And that the word adipati comes to be used in relation to monasteries as being the abbot of the monastery, particularly of a large monastery or of a network of monasteries. Okay, so when we have adi prefixed to sila, it gives a sense of the higher sila. And adicita, again, prefixed to citta, gives a sense of the higher mind. And adipanya gives a sense of the higher wisdom. So the trainings here are not simply the trainings in sila, samadhi, and panya, but this will be the training in a higher dimension of sila, citta or samadhi, and panya. Okay, so these are the three tasks which are to be practiced by a samana. Yeah, so people today sometimes think, okay, the task for the Buddhist monk is to, in the common tradition, to attend services they call dana, or to attend offerings of meals and so on. This is in common Sri Lankan tradition. Dana, bana, and pirit. So dana is to go to alms offerings. These are the three tasks of the typical Buddhist monk in Sri Lankan Buddhism. Dana, to go to accept house offerings, to go outside to receive meal offerings. Bana is preaching, to preach the Dhamma, and pirit is to recite blessing sutras. So if you ask, what is the typical task of the ordinary Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka? It's dana, bana, and pirita suttas. But what the Buddha says, the true task of the samana is the training in the higher sila, virtuous conduct, training in the higher mind, in samadhi, and training in the higher wisdom. Okay, so then the Buddha then instructs the monks that you should train yourselves thus. We will have a keen desire to undertake the training in the higher sila, the higher mind, and the higher wisdom. Okay, so this just lays out what the three trainings are, but doesn't define them. To get explanations of what is involved in them, we have to pass over a number of suttas. And then we come to sutta number 89. So this will give formal definitions of these three trainings. Actually, these are abridged here. Let's see if I can find. No, I'd have to go searching, but okay, I could fill in maybe translate directly from the Pali. So the Pali abridges also. Okay, so the definition for the training in the higher sila says that it's speaking about the training of a monk in the rules of discipline. So here it says that the monk is virtuous, he dwells restrained by the rules of the patimokkha, the code of monastic disciplines. He possesses good behavior and a suitable alms resort. He sees danger in the least faults, and then he trains in the training rules that he's undertaken. So that is the definition of the training in the higher sila, the higher good behavior. Okay, then comes the training in the higher mind, and this is defined by the attainment of the 4 jhanas. So the jhanas from the first to the fourth. Then what is the training in the higher wisdom? So this is said in this sutta that the monk understands as it really is the 4 noble truths. This is suffering, dukkha. This is its origin. This is its cessation. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. That is the training in the higher wisdom. So these definitions, I would say, are setting a pretty high bar, a high standard for the observance. And so what I would say is that when one is undertaking, for example, the training in the higher mind, it doesn't mean that one has actually attained the 4 jhanas, but one is undertaking the practice for attaining the 4 jhanas. And when one is undertaking the training in the higher wisdom, it doesn't mean that one has actually attained this breakthrough realization to the 4 noble truths, but one is undertaking the training that will lead to that breakthrough realization. Okay, now this sutta should be read in conjunction with the next sutta. Okay, everything begins in the same way, everything is identical, except for the definition of the training in the higher wisdom. So here, what is the training in the higher wisdom? Here, with the destruction of the asavas, the taints, a bhikkhu realizes for himself with direct knowledge in this very life, the taintless liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom, and having entered upon it, he dwells in it. Okay, so the only thing that is different between this sutta and the previous one is the definition of the training in the higher wisdom. And what kind of distinction is being highlighted by the difference in these 2 definitions? Somebody? Well, that is what is said, but there's a distinction that's being highlighted by these different explanations.
What is the difference between an arahant and a regular normal person?
And
A regular, a lower stream enter and above.
Okay, yeah, that's it. The realization of the 4 noble truths, that is the achievement of the stream enterer. The stream enterer is one who directly sees the 4 noble truths, all 4 of them. But seeing the Four Noble Truths is not the culmination of the path, but rather based on the seeing of the Four Noble Truths, one then goes on to cultivate that understanding of the Four Truths. That seeing of the Four Truths, one cultivates it, develops it, and as one develops it, then it culminates in the fourth stage of realization, the stage of arhatship. So the stream enter is the first stage. One cultivates that insight to the point of the second stage, the stage of the once returner, cultivates it further, one reaches the stage of the non-returner. And when one cultivates that insight to its culmination, then that insight brings the eradication of the asavas. The asavas I call the most fundamental and most primordial stratum of the defilements that lies sort of at the deepest level of the mind. And as that wisdom becomes clearer and sharper, it digs deeper and deeper till it reaches that fundamental level and uproots the asavas so that they can never arise again. And that issues in the anasavam ceto vimutti panya vimutti, the liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom that is taintless with the destruction of the taints. Okay, so anyway, so this shows us the three kinds of higher training that the Buddha has taught. These are the trainings for a samana. But doesn't mean that somebody who is not a renunciant can't practice them, or maybe not in their fullness, taking the precepts of a monastic, because that would be rather cumbersome in household life. But one observes, I would say, in this case, quite strictly and diligently, more than the 5 precepts. I think to be a adhi-sila for a householder, it should include changing the 3rd precept to brahmacharya, to a brahmacharya veramani, or to, we call this a brahmacharya panchasila. That is, observing the 3rd precept as celibacy, abstaining from any kind of sexual conduct. And then the other 4 precepts remain the same, and on upositas, or close to the uposita, if more convenient, one should observe the uposita sila, that is the 8 precepts. Abstaining, especially what's the big difference, would be abstaining from meals beyond the midday. But also householders can train for the 4 jhanas, and I mean, there are householders, lay people who attain, at least I've heard, attaining even to 4 jhanas, and should train for attaining the 4 fruits, or at least developing insight in the direction of the 4 fruits. Okay, so these gives us definitions of the threefold training. Maybe any questions at this point? I'm always afraid when nobody has questions that the talk is boring. Or just too flat and... What is that?
It sounds very tough.
Yeah. Okay, but as I said, the suttas are setting the high bar for what the Buddha wants his disciples to achieve. So it doesn't mean that we have to rate ourselves against this high bar, and then if we're not able to achieve this high level of sila, this high level of the jhanas, or to attain stream entry, let alone arhatship, doesn't mean that we rate ourselves as a failure and give up. But rather, the way I always see it, we're on this path that leads irreversibly to the goal. And if we just go on walking this path, even if it takes life after life after life, eventually we get there. Like this is part of the Dhamma Niyama, the law of the Dhamma. Yeah, but the Buddha is not going to say to his disciples, okay, this is the training of a samana, of an ascetic. You live a comfortable life. When you hear the gong ring, you go up to the refectory for your meals. Then you go back to your room and you can take it easy, chit-chat around the tea table. And then when it gets to be evening time, then you go to sleep and wake up the next morning when you hear the bell ring for the group recitation, then you recite together, you do a little 10 or 15 minutes of meditation, then you go up for your breakfast again. But he wants them to develop that keen desire, tiba chanda, for the training in the higher behavior, conduct, higher mind, higher wisdom. And even true confessions, I mean, I rate myself against this and think, oh, too high for me. But I have confidence that this is the path, and so one does one's best. So don't think because I'm teaching like this that, people whispering, he must have the 4 jhanas. Where is he? At the level of Srimantara, level of Arhat? No, still a long way to go. What? People are not getting up and walking out? Okay, now we can go back to the earlier suttas, which sort of actually give a lot of interesting information, sometimes a bit humorous. Uh-oh, I think I got in trouble with what I said. Okay. So this sutta is called the donkey. Okay, so it says, suppose a donkey is following behind a herd of cattle, thinking, I'm a cow too. I'm a cow too. But he wouldn't look like the other cows. Well, he wouldn't look like the cows. I shouldn't say other cows. He wouldn't look like the cows. Different kind of ears, different kind of, what do you call a snout? The donkey's snout, is it? His braying would not be like that of the cows, and his footprint would not be like that of the cows. Yet he follows right behind the herd of cattle thinking, I'm a cow too, I'm a cow too. Okay, and so we have a monk who's following behind the sangha of monks, the group of other monks, thinking, I'm a monk too, I'm a monk too. But his desire for the higher training in sila, for the training in the higher sila is not like that of the other monks. His desire to undertake the training in the higher mind is not like that of the other monks. His desire to undertake the training in the higher wisdom is not like that of the other monks. Yet he follows right behind the company of monks thinking, I'm a monk too, I'm a monk too. Okay, so again, the Buddha urges the monks to train, to arouse that desire to undertake the training. Yeah, so from what I said earlier, it seems I have to put myself with the donkeys.
Then I'm following the donkey.
Okay, so now we're going to have another a simile which illustrates the threefold training. And this is a simile that would have been probably familiar to a lot of the Buddha's disciples. A lot of them would have come from agricultural backgrounds, and so they were familiar with the process of preparing a field for cultivating crops. Okay, so the Buddha speaks about the three preliminary tasks of a farmer. So first, the farmer plows and harrows the field. Harrowing, I guess, means creating, what do you call these? Do we have anybody from a farming background? Furrows, good, in the field. Then he sows seeds at the proper time, and then he occasionally irrigates the field with water. I guess drains it if there's too much water. Okay, so the Buddha says that there are three preliminary tasks for the monk, thus the threefold training. Okay, so actually we could probably develop the simile at length in greater detail. So plowing and harrowing the field would be like undertaking the training in the higher sila, by which one regulates one's conduct to prevent transgressions, moral transgressions by body and speech, and restraint of the mind to restrain the impulses to transgression. And then one engages in good conduct of body and speech. Okay, then sowing the seeds at the proper time would be like the training in the higher mind. This would be the practice of actually the samatha meditation aimed at samadhi. Of course, that is like, you could say it's sowing the seeds. Actually, to my mind, is something still like preparing the field. But anyway, this compares it to sowing seeds at the proper time. And then irrigating the field and draining the field would be like the training in the higher wisdom. Okay, this is an interesting sutta, a little bit paradoxical, we'll see. Okay, here a monk is from the Vajjian community. The Vajjis were people who lived largely in the city of Vesali and the surrounding area. Okay, so this monk comes to the Buddha and says to him, every half month, that's on the full moon and the dark moon days, that's the day for reciting the Patimokkha, the code of monastic discipline. So he says more than 150 training rules come up for recitation. And so this monk says, I can't train in them. It's like too many rules to follow. Actually, if you look at the training rules, it seems like there are so many. Even now, the number has increased to the point of really 220 rules. But so many of them, you have to really go out of your way to commit a transgression. And quite a number of them are not really concerned with ethical behavior as such, but with what we call good, proper etiquette in the monastic life. So one shouldn't be intimidated and think 150 rules or 220 rules, just so oppressive. But let's see how the Buddha handles this. Okay, so now the Buddha, instead of asking him to train in the 150 rules or 220 rules, says, can you train in the three trainings? The training in the higher virtue, virtuous conduct, the training in the higher mind, and the training in the higher wisdom. The monk says, I can. So therefore, train in the three trainings, the training in the higher virtuous behavior, training in the higher mind, training in the higher wisdom. But this is where there's a bit of a self-contradiction in the sutta. So you look at the definition, what is the training in the higher virtuous behavior? Here, the monk dwells restrained by the rules of the patimokkha. So there you come. To fulfill the higher virtuous behavior, you have to live in accordance with the 150 or 220 rules of the patimokkha. So how does one resolve that contradiction?
As a guest, one cannot memorize the patimokkha does not mean he ever violate any one of them. It does not have the ability to recite it.
Yeah.
It's that he may observe it diligently.
Actually that's a good point. It could be that the monk had problem memorizing the rules of the patimokkha and being able to recite them from memory. But perhaps it's just enough for him to follow the examples of the other monks. But also we're going to see down below in one of the later suttas that the text is going to make a distinction between rules that are fundamental to the spiritual life, adi brahmacharika rules, and what are called the lesser and minor rules. So it could be that what's actually being indicated here is the importance of following those fundamental rules rather than the lesser and minor rules. Anyway, let us go on. Okay, so you train in these 3 trainings, and then as you train in them, you will abandon lust, hatred, and delusion. And with the abandoning of lust, hatred, and delusion, you will do nothing unwholesome or resort to anything bad. Actually, this is an interesting phrase here. In terms of the point about training in the higher virtuous behavior. So what happens with the abandoning of lust, hatred, and delusion is that there will be no, we might call this a transgression of the rules with some kind of moral significance, some kind of moral import. But a lot of the rules, if you'll see this, if you ever look at the patimokkha, don't have much of a moral significance. For example, the monk is not supposed to be separated from his 3 robes. So he's always supposed to have the 3 robes in his possession every night when going to sleep, that the 3 robes should be secured on his person or in his lodging, his residence. So there's no moral significance in that, but it seems to be that part of the reason is that in the Buddha's time, it was very difficult to manufacture, to make robes, to make even cloth. They didn't have all of the machinery that developed during the Industrial Revolution. So it would be a great effort on the part of people to make a robe and then to offer it to a monk. And so one has to take responsibility for that robe, not let it, and cloth was considered very valuable in that time. Nowadays, I have to say, if you go to any monastery, the storeroom is filled with robes. Even my storeroom, I tell people, please don't offer me robes because I have enough robes. And now the material is so durable that, yeah, this robe I think is about 2 years old and it's still in fairly good condition. Other robes that I've been using I have one from 8 or 9 years. So if you take those robes that are there now, they'll last me till I'm 110, 120. Okay, but in the Buddha's time, also the monks would the robes were made out of cotton, generally out of cotton, which wears out more than these partly synthetic materials. The monks would be traveling 8-9 months out of the year through jungle and brush, and so the robes get a lot of wear and tear. And so one has to take responsibility for them. Okay, but this rule, it doesn't have a direct moral significance. Okay, not to store food for the next day, because part of the discipline of being a monastic is to depend on the generosity of people, rather than hoarding things and keeping things to keep oneself secure. Okay, so what is being indicated here, what's to be avoided, are doing things, actions that stem from lust or greed, hatred and delusion. Actually, storing food also stems from greed, since one wants to one feels a sense of insecurity, and so one wants to be secure, to have enough food for the next day. Okay, so then sometime later, that monk trained in the virtuous behavior, the higher mind, the higher wisdom. As he trained, he abandoned lust, hatred, and delusion, and then he did nothing unwholesome, nor did he resort to anything bad. Okay, next sutta. Okay, this just explains how a monk is called a trainee. So the word here is seika, and sometimes technically the word seika is used to mean a disciple from the stage who has entered the path of stream entry, the irreversible path, up through one on the path to arahatship. And then the arahat is called the aseka, the non-trainee, the one who has completed the training. But here, the text uses or defines the word trainee in a more general sense as anyone who trains in this good behavior, who trains to develop the samadhi of the jhanas, and who trains in the insight that will culminate in the higher wisdom, the penetration of the Four Noble Truths. Okay, then there comes a verse attached to the sutta. Okay, so it says, as the trainee trains along the straight path, the knowledge of destruction arises fast, immediately followed by final knowledge. Okay, this the text uses rather technical terminology. So the first knowledge that arises, it's, here the Pali says, kayasmin jnanam. Sometimes it's combined to a compound, kaya jnanam, the knowledge of destruction. And this is said to be the knowledge that occurs within the path of the path of arhatship, the knowledge that brings about the destruction of the residual defilements. According to the commentary, it says, first the knowledge of the path arises, which is called the knowledge of destruction because it is associated with the path, and the path is called destruction because it destroys the defilements. So the path arises, destroying the defilements. And then it said, actually this is interesting, it says, tato anya anantara. Anantara means without anything in between, without interval. And then anya is what is translated as final knowledge. This is the knowledge usually expressed in the suttas when the disciple declares, he says, the disciple understands birth is destroyed, or birth is finished, the round of rebirths is finished, what the spiritual life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no coming back to this state again. Okay, so this is said to be the final knowledge is said arises immediately after the knowledge of destruction. The commentary identifies this knowledge that arises, final knowledge that arises immediately after, as the fruit of arhatship. But the commentary, this is getting a bit technical, but the commentary, the way I see it, is bringing in a distinction of path and fruit that derives from the Abhidhamma, but that we don't find within the suttas themselves. I don't know if I should get into this very technical point. Okay, but it seems to me that what is meant here is that the knowledge of destruction, we don't make a distinction of path and fruit, but it's the knowledge that occurs at the culmination of the practice that destroys all of the residual defilements. And then one emerges from that experience, that sort of world-transcending experience in which one knows and sees, gains that knowledge that uproots all the defilements. And then emerging from that, one then looks back upon it and sees that the defilements have all been destroyed. And now the work has been completed. Okay, then it says, thereafter, actually I think, okay, when the fetters of existence are destroyed, for one liberated by final knowledge, the knowledge arises, my liberation is unshakable. Actually, I think I have to backtrack on what I just said. Maybe after I confess, I think maybe the commentary is correct here. Because it's saying, it seems that there are three knowledges here. Okay, first, there's the knowledge of destruction. Okay, this would be the knowledge that arises in the path that brings the destruction of the defilements. Then this is said to be followed immediately by final knowledge. So this would be the knowledge within the fruit, that momentary or very brief experience of the fruit of arhatship. And then comes a third knowledge. This would be after one has gone through that fruition experience, then comes a reviewing knowledge through which one knows that the round of rebirths has been finished, what had to be done has been done, the spiritual life has been lived, there's no coming back to any further existence. Or here expressed differently, my liberation is unshakable. Yeah, so the commentary explains that this is reviewing knowledge. And so the verses actually seem to confirm the three stages of knowledge recognized in the Abhidhamma and commentaries: path knowledge, fruition knowledge, and reviewing knowledge. Any questions on this? It's a bit, as I said, a bit technical. Okay, then we move on to the next sutta. Okay, here the text opens with the Buddha declaring that every half month these 150 training rules come up for recitation, and clansmen or people who desire their own good train in these. Okay, so these, he says, these training rules are all comprised in the 3 trainings. But actually, the training rules fall more precisely in the training in the higher virtuous behavior. But the training in the higher virtuous behavior is the foundation or basis for the training in the higher mind, and that is the basis for the training in the higher wisdom. Okay, now the text continues that here a monk fulfills virtuous behavior, but cultivates compassion and wisdom only to a moderate extent. Okay, now it continues, and this is the interesting point. He falls into offenses or transgressions in regard to the lesser and minor training rules and rehabilitates himself. For what reason? Because I have not said that he is incapable of this. Or in other words, putting it more positively, that one who is even fulfilling virtuous behavior can still transgress against the lesser and minor training rules. That's not impossible. But after committing transgressions of those rules, when he recognizes that he's committed a transgression, then he'll rehabilitate himself, that there are ways to emerge from those transgressions. And that is, the way is to make a confession for a monk to make confession to another monk, for a bhikkhuni, a nun, to make confession to another bhikkhuni. Okay, the heavy offense, we'll come to the heavier offenses, okay. Okay, but in regard to those training rules that are fundamental to the spiritual life, in conformity with the spiritual life, his behavior is constant and steadfast. Having undertaken the training rules, he trains in them. Okay, so this indicates, the way I understand it, in regard to the earlier sutta when the Buddha says, don't worry about the 150 rules, but train in the higher virtuous behavior. So he's saying that be sure to train in those rules that are fundamental to the spiritual life, in conformity with the spiritual life. And there's a note first on the minor and training rules. Actually, there are different opinions here. Okay, maybe some of you know, who are familiar with the suttas, know that after the Buddha passed away, according to the tradition, a council was held bringing together some 500 fully accomplished monks who are arahats, to collect the discourse collections and the discipline, the vinaya. And in the course of this council, the point was raised that the Buddha said, before his passing away, the Buddha told the monks that if you wish, after I pass away, you can abolish the lesser and minor rules of training. So at the first council, when the monks were holding their discussions, the question came up. The Buddha said we can abolish the lesser and minor rules of training. Should we do so? And then further question came up, what are the lesser and minor rules of training? And then, according to the text, different opinions were advanced. This group is lesser and minor, that group is lesser and minor. They couldn't reach agreement on this. And then Mahakassapa, who is noted for his strict observance of every minor aspect of the training, said, a number of our rules concern our relations with householders, if we abolish these rules and then we start behaving in ways that deviate from those rules, then our lay followers will start to say, while the Buddha was alive, the monks followed the discipline very scrupulously. Now that the Buddha's passed away, they're just discarding the training and behaving in any way that he wants to. And so, under the leadership of Mahakassapa, or at the recommendation of Mahakassapa, they decided to uphold and maintain the entire code of discipline, the entire Patimokkha and all of the lesser rules that come in some of the other collections, the Mahavagga and the Chulavagga, the other parts of the Vinaya. Okay, and so what are the minor, lesser and minor rules was never formally defined. But I think one can, using one's capacity for discernment, at least there are certain rules which are very clearly lesser and minor, and other rules that one could say are fundamental to the spiritual life. Okay, so one would say certainly fundamental rules to the spiritual life would be the offenses are grouped into different classes. So we would say the 4 parajikas, those are offenses which, if they're transgressed, they entail sort of formal expulsion from the Sangha, that one loses one's status as a fully ordained monk living in community, living in the community of the Sangha. So this is sexual intercourse, stealing anything of a sufficient value that one would be subject to legal punishment, killing or intentionally causing the death of a human being, and then making knowingly, deliberately making false claims to higher spiritual attainments. Okay, so that's the class of the gravest offenses, the expulsion or defeat offenses, called parajika in Pali. Then come a class of offenses that entail a formal meeting of the Sangha. And then after that, you have to undergo a rather laborious process of rehabilitation before one could be fully reinstated as a member of the community. So these include, masturbation to the point of emission, with a mind of lust, for a monk, touching a woman, trying to cajole a woman into having sexual intercourse with oneself, and a number of other rules. There are 13 rules in that category. Okay, then there are other rules which I would say are of lesser gravity, and in those lesser rules, one could still distinguish, I would say, some that are quite fundamental to the spiritual life and that they concern an ethical training, whereas others are of secondary importance. For example, there's a rule against deliberate false speech. So false speech would be certainly, particularly if it's intended to secure some benefit for oneself or to harm somebody else, even though one could rehabilitate oneself by confession, but still, because of the moral nature of that offense, I would say that it's fundamental to the spiritual life. Okay, many other rules, like using water that has not been strained, because one is supposed to strain the water in the Buddha's time in order to remove microscopic or very minute living beings. Digging the earth. It's not permissible for a monk, fully ordained monk, to dig the earth himself, but it's not an action of moral significance because novices are allowed to dig the earth. And so the monks can instruct, they're not supposed to directly instruct somebody else to dig the earth. So you can't say, it would be nice to have a well here. We need a well, dig the earth here. one can't say that, but one can bring a novice, or one could bring a monastery attendant or a worker and say, it would be wonderful if we had a well here. Hint, hint, hint. And if he's one who's been properly trained, he'll pick up the hint and start digging. If he hasn't been properly trained, he might say, yeah, it would be really wonderful to have a well there. And then he's in danger of losing his job. Okay, so anyway, I think the important point here is that the text is distinguishing these rules that are fundamental to the spiritual life. And it says that one who's keen on the training in the higher virtuous behavior is constant and steadfast in observing those rules. And in regard to the lesser and minor rules, one can transgress them, and one will then rehabilitate oneself. And even practicing in that way, it said that it's possible to destroy the 3 fetters and become a stream enterer, no longer subject to rebirth in the lower realm, fixed in destiny, and so on. Okay, and what's also significant in this passage is that this monk who becomes the stream enterer fulfills virtuous behavior, which is the observance of the rules fundamental to the spiritual life, and cultivates samadhi and wisdom only to a moderate extent. So if you're not, perfect in samadhi and wisdom, don't give up on the possibility that you might become a stream enterer. Of course, it's possible, even with a moderate degree of concentration and wisdom. Probably the concentration here would be access concentration, or it could even be, in the Mahasi Sayadaw system, what they call the momentary concentration that develops in connection with insight. Okay, now we have the monk who fulfills virtuous behavior, cultivates concentration and wisdom to the moderate extent. Okay, everything else is said to be the same, except that he reaches the next higher stage of achievement with the utter destruction of the 3 lower fetters and with the diminishing of greed, hatred, and delusion. He becomes a once returner who comes back to this world one more time and then reaches liberation. Okay, now the next level, we have the monk who fulfills virtuous behavior and samadhi concentration, but cultivates wisdom only to a moderate extent. Okay, that was said of this monk has the higher degree of concentration than the other 2. With the utter destruction of the 5 lower fetters, he is one of spontaneous birth who takes rebirth. This would be no longer in the desire realm, but in the fine material or form realm, and attains final liberation there without returning from that world. Yeah, rather strangely, the commentary doesn't define what is meant by developing concentration to a moderate extent. And I could say that there could be like a whole range of levels in developing concentration there. It could be perhaps a stronger degree of the momentary concentration, a more firmly established access concentration, or it can be developing the four jhanas, but not establishing them very firmly, very strongly. Okay, then we come to the last person in this taxonomy of disciples. So here we have the monk who fulfills virtuous behavior, concentration, and wisdom. But even this one falls into offenses in regard to the lesser and minor training rules and rehabilitates himself. Again, everything is the same, but in regard to those rules that are fundamental to the spiritual life, in conformity with the spiritual life, his behavior is constant and steadfast. He trains in those rules, and then with the destruction of the asavas, he realizes the taintless liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom, enters it and dwells in it. So interestingly, this is a person who's training for the fruit of arhatship, and even this person can fall into offenses regarding the lesser and minor rules of training. And I have to say that this attitude is, or what is said in the sutta, is somewhat different from an attitude that prevails now in at least the more conservative and orthodox side of the Theravada tradition, where it's held that you have to be absolutely flawless and perfect in observing all of the monastic rules before you can hope to have any success in meditation. And so it's quite common, what I found in my time in Sri Lanka, that monks don't do meditation because they think under our living conditions today, we can't observe all of these rules flawlessly. So many pressures on us, to deviate from this little rule, that little rule. And so, we don't yet have sufficient merits to start the practice of meditation. So we'll try our best to observe the rules, recognizing that we can't observe them perfectly, and hopefully we'll come back to the human realm in the time when Maitreya Buddha arises in the world. And then we can observe the rules perfectly and then achieve realized nirvana under Maitreya Buddha. Yeah, so I think that attitude becomes something of an obstacle to people making determined effort in their practice. Yeah, so that's one kind of attitude. Another kind of attitude is there was another kind that occurred to me. Then it just slipped my mind. Yeah, there are monks who spend all of their time like studying all of the little details, especially as elaborated in the commentaries and sub-commentaries on the Vinaya, in order to make sure that they're not committing any of these most minor types of transgressions. And then if they commit any of these minor transgressions, then they become overwhelmed with a sense of remorse, and then that becomes an obstacle to their practice. Okay, but this is not to encourage an attitude in any way that one could just behave in any way that one wants. Because within a community, like even regarding the lesser and minor rules, in order to maintain harmony within the community and the spirit of, let's say, the discipline, an atmosphere of discipline within the community, one has to observe the training rules the way the others in the community follow them. Okay, like, okay, in Sri Lanka, at least until recently, monks would not eat cheese in the evening, because cheese would be considered a kind of food. Okay, but you see, in Thailand, through the centuries, they didn't have cheese. I think cheese was introduced by Westerners. And so when the Buddhist monks had to find a Pali word for cheese, they used the word, the Pali word, which in the Pali text, canonical text, signifies butter, navanita, no nita. Now, butter is one of the items which is said to be allowable in the evening, afternoon or evening. And so it's what's commonly done in Sri Lanka and Myanmar is to make this mixture of butter, ghee, sugar, and honey. They call it chatu madhuva, the 4 sweet things. And it's sort of served in little cups, and it's very delicious. Not so good for the health, though it's called a medicinal item. But they eat it sometimes in great quantities, which I think is why you sometimes see Sri Lankan Burmese monks who are not eating in the evening, but too fat, an unhealthy degree, and then they get diabetes and heart condition. But maybe not only from that, but also in Sri Lanka when they drink the tea, sometimes we'll put in 4 spoons of sugar into the tea, and then have 3 or 4 cups of tea like that in the afternoon, not to speak of with the breakfast. Yeah, you're shaking your head, but it's true. And then they get diabetes, and they're not so, everybody takes it as just a routine matter, just the way the body works. You get diabetes, not realizing that it's all of the sugar that you're putting in that could be responsible. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. So in Sri Lanka and Burma, they would take the chatu madhu, the 4 sweet things mixed together. In Thailand, when the cheese was introduced, they call it navanita butter. And so cheese becomes allowable. And so when I would go to the Thai monasteries or the Western monasteries coming out from Thailand, like the Achan Chah-derived monasteries, there they would serve in the evening block of cheese with a knife, and you just cut off as much cheese as you want. I mean, usually the scrupulous monks will just take a little piece of cheese, because the purpose is not to delight the taste buds, but to give a boost of energy for the evening. Okay, so I was saying that one would observe the rules that accord with the community that one is living in. So if one is living, say, in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan monastery, say back in the 1980s, I think now the Sri Lankan monasteries have now come under the influence of the Thai practice of allowing cheese in the evening. Like when I was in the London Buddhist Vihara just a few days ago, they served cheese in the evening. But in the 1980s, maybe early 1990s, before that connection developed, you never get cheese in the evening there. So if I was in a Sri Lankan monastery in the 1980s, then I wouldn't bring out a block of cheese and let's say, let's cut this up and have it in the evening, because it would sort of go against the standard for observance there. Okay, so just concluding the sutta, the Buddha says, thus one who cultivates in part succeeds in part, one who cultivates fully reaches fulfillment. These training rules, I say, are not barren. Okay, the next sutta, I think we could fit this in quickly because it follows the pattern of the one we just covered, except it makes here a distinction between 3 different grades of stream enterers. So it says, with the utter destruction of 3 fetters, this one is called I translate it as the Pali expression is a no, I've forgotten the expression. Satta paramasa, satta paramita. Satta katu parama, which means 7 times at most. I translate it as a 7 times at most attainer. Then it said, who after roaming and wandering on among devas and humans 7 times at most makes an end of dukkha. So this is call it the dullest or most sluggish grade of stream enterer, who takes rebirth 7 more times, then reaches liberation. The next grade of stream enterer is called the family to family attainer. So it said that this one takes rebirth amongst good families 2 or 3 times, then makes an end of suffering. And then the last one is the ekabiji, the 1 seed attainer, who takes 1 more rebirth in the human realm and then makes an end of suffering. So those are all 3 different grades of stream enterer. Then we come to the distinction amongst the non-returners, 5 different grades of non-returners. I won't go into them in detail. And then finally, the arahat. Okay, are there any questions now that arise out of the material we've covered? Yeah, please there should be a wireless microphone.
Yeah, I got a question. What is the difference between, you mean the liberation and the freedom? You say freedom and liberation. You mentioned liberation of mind and liberation of
liberation
wisdom.
by wisdom.
So is there any difference between, free of my mind and free of my wisdom or something like that?
Oh, I see. The difference between liberation of mind and liberation by wisdom. Is that the question?
No, freedom.
Freedom. I didn't use the word freedom. Maybe I said that the mind is free.
No. My question is
Give him the microphone.
Is it difference between liberation and freedom in terms of using it as a liberation of mind and liberation of wisdom?
Liberation by wisdom.
Is it interchangeable, say, freedom of mind and freedom
If you want to use that translation,
wisdom?
you can. But the original Pali word has a very precise meaning, vimukti. And so I don't like to use the word freedom because freedom is such a general word that people use the expressions freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, or freedom to do what one wants. But the Pali word is very, very precise, and so I like to use a more technical word, liberation, rather than freedom, which brings along too many nuances from our ordinary vocabulary.
So what you mean is liberation is more specific.
Yeah.
And narrow. It's a
it's a narrow,
smaller concept.
more precise.
More precise.
a more precise meaning. It means, in this case, liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom. It means the liberation that comes, the liberation of the mind from all defilements, right down to the most fundamental level, that comes about through the wisdom that understands and sees into the Four Noble Truths.
But is it from inside ourselves, or is it from outside the liberation?
Oh, the liberation, of course, has to come from the inside.
Inside, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Boy, his question.
Bhante, I have a question about the three knowledges of an arahant.
Yeah.
So the third one, reviewing knowledge, occurs after the fruition of an arahantship. So it's the third moment. So it comes after the person has achieved arahantship. Is that right?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is the knowledge that looks back after one has gone through that experience. It must be like a really dramatic experience of where the wisdom faculty cuts off those defilements. And then there would be like the moment where one experiences that freedom from the defilements. And then after that, one sort of looks back and reflects and sees now the mind is free, utterly free from all of those defilements. And so then one knows that finished, the way it's expressed, usually expressed as finished is birth. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back. Here, in this verse, it said, one knows my liberation is unshakable.
And the second one follows immediately after the first one. So,
Yeah.
Bhante, you say you agree with the commentary explanation that after the moment of...
Yeah, except maybe explaining it in terms of individual mind moments, which the commentary does, that is probably rooted in the Abhidhamma treatment of the mind in terms of individual moments. But if we take like a sutta approach, we don't have to see it in terms of these individual mind moments, but it can be an experience that maybe extends over several, an experience that has a certain duration in time, not just one moment this occurs, the next moment that occurs, followed by a third moment like that. So there's a certain duration in time, but within the first stage of that experience, the wisdom faculty is eradicating defilements. Then there would come what's called the final knowledge. So that would be probably the knowledge within the fruition experience, which maybe extends, let us say 30 seconds, going on 30 seconds, maybe a whole minute, not just one moment like that. And then after that, then when the fetters of our existence are destroyed, then the knowledge arises, my liberation is unshakable. So that occurs after that final knowledge itself.
So Bhante, did Pali word Anguttara?
A Pali word for?
Anguttara.
Anya.
No, Anguttara. Immediately
Anguttara
allows...
Anantara.
Anantara allows...
Antara means in between. Anantara means nothing in between, without interval.
So that word allows the interpretation of a duration in time. That Pali word allows the interpretation of a duration in time.
I would say so.
Thank you.
It doesn't mean that the knowledge occurs in one finger snap after, but just that there is a phase in which the wisdom is uprooting and destroying the defilements, then nothing comes in between, but right after that, one doesn't go off and engage in other activities, but right after that, that knowledge arises in which one is experiencing the fruition of liberation. And then comes the confirmation of that with the reviewing knowledge. Okay, any further questions? Okay, then we'll end for this morning. We won't have a Q&A session because things are getting... I want to take also, because we have the summer camp starts in the afternoon, and I want to take a little rest before the summer camp starts. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. And then, let's see, we do have a class next week, right? That's July 6th. Yeah, we'll have a class next week. Okay, so we'll end with sharing of the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata Deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Eta vitacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Eta vitacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhuta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Eta vitacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sata anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Pavagopadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino tukha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, then we stand and we do 3 half bows to the Buddha.